Welcome to the Gist on Stat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Today we are going to be talking about India-Australia ties, and our very, very special guest today is Mr. Kim Herriot-Darragh, Research Fellow at the Australia-India Institute. Thank you so much for joining us, Kim. It's a delight to have you with us, and I appreciate you taking time out at such short notice.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here talking with you about this really important relationship.
It is an important relationship from both sides, I'm quite sure. But let's start with the recent visit of Defence Minister Rajnath Singh to Australia, and I believe you were pretty actively involved in that whole visit. What were sort of your takeaways from that visit?
I look at this visit and it's symbolically significant because it's the first time in quite many years that an Indian Defence Minister has visited. So that in itself gives you a sense of the level of priority that is being accorded to the relationship. To me, though, when I look at the announcements, the big takeaway is that we're now moving from plucking the low-hanging fruit in the relationship and away from the items that are easily agreed and make a good headline. And we're now moving towards the things that will really enable genuine cooperation. And I think that we're going to see more of that as a trend, perhaps less flashy headlines, but more indications to defence professionals that the defence organisations at both sides are reaching a maturity in their level of cooperation.
Mm-hmm. So what were the things that actually happened on the ground during his visit? What was the itinerary like?
I understand it was quite an impactful one. My favourite part was to see the images of the Raksha Mantri aboard an Australian aircraft, which was refuelling one of our fighter jets. That's significant because, of course, the two countries signed an agreement whereby they're able to help refuel each other's aircraft. That sounds like quite a simple agreement, but it involves fairly technical level of operation and cooperation. And it's the kind of thing that really helps extend the mutual range of each other's air forces. So this kind of groundwork for cooperation means that both militaries are much more flexible and agile in the way that they respond to security challenges in the region.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that we are having this visit, I think, after quite a while. We haven't had such a visit for a while. And I suspect, okay, let me phrase it in a different way. There has always been this slight sort of hesitation on India's part ever since Australia sort of stepped out of the Quad, I think in the early 1990s, about Australia's two sort of motivations behind the relationship. Do you think we progressed a long way since then?
I think the level of progress has been astonishing, and we almost suffer from the from the very fact that we've made such fast progress, because every time there's a significant engagement between senior leaders of both countries, everybody's looking out for the next big announcement. Sometimes, of course, that won't be pragmatic, but it really tells you how fast they've moved. I think the real challenge now is not so much to ensure that both countries make the same political decisions or agree that they'll always act in a certain way with each other. But really what we're seeing is the laying of groundwork that enables flexibility. So the defence organisations on both sides will, of course, follow the directions of their government. But what they're ensuring now is that they have the familiarity. They know how to plan together. They're getting better at operating together. And they're building the basics of trust, which are so foundational, so that it means that if they are called upon by their governments to respond, they can, and they're not starting from scratch. They're in fact able to really launch into things straight away.
I've been, as you well know, I've been sort of following you ever since one of your fascinating talks and your articles, which sort of aggressively promote a better relationship with India. I was wondering that, apart from the defense part of it, which is, of course, a very crucial factor, I remember that Australia had once launched this fat book which sort of looked at the business relationship. And it was a very fascinating book because it broke India up into states and said that, each state has its own kind of business synergy, and so Australia should reach out to each state depending on that, rather than seeing India as a whole. I don't know where that book went because it was quite a fascinating book, and I actually suggested it to various other embassies here, saying that that is really how you should be looking at India, not just as one entity, but as a conglomeration of states. Do you think that's the right approach, even when it comes to something as interesting as defense? Because of course, defense is a federal subject, but if you're looking at tie-ups or production and stuff like that, do you think that kind of an approach works?
I wish I had that kind of a resource before I moved to India. It might have helped me a great deal. I think that what you're describing gets to the heart of a challenge, something that I think is Australia's main challenge now, and that is India literacy. I think for a long time, our government and our defence organisations, and in some ways our business community, has been geared towards engaging the near region. And I think there's always been an acknowledgement and interest in India, and there's always been ties. But I think that we have a lot of work to do to heighten literacy on both sides. And I think that the very reason that we need those kinds of books highlights that need. I think on the defence front, one of the biggest challenges is that India is trying to foster self-reliance, so is Australia. That means, to put it very simplistically, both countries seek to make and produce and sell rather than to buy from each other. And so what we're seeing now is a lot of enthusiasm, but a lot of careful work happening at the working level to try to find areas of genuine commonality, whether that looks like a joint venture, for example, or perhaps jointly collaborating on something that goes for export to a third country. That it takes hard work. And I think it requires a genuine understanding of each other's industrial environments. I don't think either country is quite there yet, but I think it's really gratifying that there was a trade mission in India just recently. And of course, the Raksha Mantri himself was heavily engaged in discussions on defence industry collaboration while he was in Australia.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you say that because, like I said, one of the reasons I think Australia initially did walk away from the Quad for a minute was because it didn't want to antagonize China, right? What has changed since then? I mean, has Australia now taken a sort of a, I wouldn't say tougher, but a slightly more pragmatic position towards China?
I think its position on China has changed. I think it's hardened. And I think Australia and India find themselves in similar positions in that they seek to manage the worst of tensions and engage where there is merit in doing so, but to be very resolute when red lines are crossed, those lines relating to sovereignty as one example. So the position has changed. I'm speaking almost anecdotally, but to give you a sense, when I first joined the bureaucracy, our overwhelming focus was really, I'll simplify it into two regions or two issues. One is managing the alliance with the US, and the other is engaging in our nearest region. And I think those two things remain very important, but for different and evolving reasons. What we're seeing now is a recognition that you can't artificially carve out the strategic environment. If you consider India, even if you are one of the remaining strategists in Australia who thinks that our main effort should be in Southeast Asia, you would be crazy if you did not cooperate with a country like India, whose influence is growing in that very region. And we have a lot of mutual interest in ensuring that we amplify each other's effect because it is becoming a more fraught strategic environment. So really, the game is about helping each other to make sure that our contributions add up to more than the sum of their parts.
Mm-hmm. How much of that is also got to do with the public perception that must have changed after the revelation that China was actually interfering in the political system in Australia?
I think that was a key part of it. One thing that was happening in the background is that many specialists who track the issues were aware of these things. So I don't know, I get the sense that sometimes outside of Australia, it's perceived as though there was a concerted effort to engage China and then it flipped and there became suddenly a greater willingness to be assertive in the face of China's behavior. I didn't see it quite the same way. I saw that there was a good sense of planning and awareness, and what we saw a very subtle change in the machinations of government as, if you like, trip points were triggered, and there was a greater awareness that engagement was only reaping dividends in some respects but not others. So you found that the strategic community slowly turned around, and a lot more work was happening on that in the background than I think might have been obvious from the outside.
Hmm. Another article of yours, which I remembered was quite interesting, was where you sort of hinted that perhaps Australia could learn a few things, or maybe take a few lessons from the way India handled the recent terrorist strikes. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
I think that this is speaking selfishly, but I think my biggest lesson from it was that Australia doesn't know enough about this region. That attack and the following clashes between the Indian and Pakistani militaries obviously brought the region to the forefront in our headlines. But it shouldn't take that kind of a crisis to do it. So I think that was lesson one for Australia. It needs to be a little bit more attuned in the region, and particularly since so much of its diaspora is, in fact, of Indian origin. I think they were also demonstrated, for example, that there are some shifts, for example, that air power in some ways took the lead in this campaign, whereas traditionally you might think about handling the border and you might think about the Indian Army as being the main center of effort. And now we're starting to see drones and uncrewed systems play a greater role in battlefields. Of course, that exists in Ukraine, and the way that they're employed there looks different to the way it's used on the line of control. And that would look different perhaps in an Australian context. But what it is showing is that the battlefield is changing. We, of course, have the greater willingness of states to use force in some circumstances because they have available to them uncrewed systems that are not as expensive as, for example, manned fighter jets, and are less costly if those platforms are lost. And we're also seeing attempts to influence the cognitive domain. So the game is very much in warfare about diminishing the other side's capacity to make decisions and to make sound decisions and to interpret the adversary's behavior and intent correctly. And that obviously was a huge theme in the India-Pakistan clash. And it's something that the Australian system needs to grapple with as well. So I have no doubt that military professionals were watching very closely.
Domestically, just as I mean, as it's happening across the world, there seems to be this sort of a movement against outsiders in many countries, slightly xenophobic kind of a thing, and a little bit of that we've already seen in Australia as well. How big a difference? I mean, how big is that movement actually? And I mean, does India have reason to worry, or do Indians in Australia have reason to worry?
So I'm conscious of two things. One is that there have been incidents of racism in Australia, and of course there is a strand of racism in Australia. I don't think we're immune from that. Two, I'm cautious about making too big a generalization because, as you're aware, social media has an amplifying effect. On the pessimistic side, one thing I'm personally worried about is the fact that, yes, there are protesters, and among those, there has been a visible presence of people who have explicitly racist views, and I think would have been much more cautious about being so open about that however many years ago. The fact that they're less shy about espousing what I think are really disgusting views worries me as an Australian. But what gratifies me and what gives me some encouragement is that they were pretty unequivocally called out as well, even among those who were protesting. I think there's a general tendency among lots of countries. We're seeing part of it happen in the US. Arguably, we may be seeing it in other parts of Asia, and we are seeing it in Australia, where there's more cynicism. It's almost as though the world looks less certain, and when it looks less certain, you're more safe if you retreat into yourself. I think that we're seeing that in a lot of countries. That doesn't need to be a catastrophic development, but it's something that defense and foreign policy planners need to think about, because I think it comes with other downsides. That is less enthusiasm to engage other countries, more of a need to justify why is it that Australia wants to invest financial, personnel, and other resources into developing relationships with countries. I think that'll be particularly important when it comes to developing and deepening newer relationships, because Australians are used to seeing collaboration with Americans, where, and the British. I think that over time, these shifts happen organically. I don't have a reason to be unduly concerned, but I think that the general trend toward more of an insular take, more of a, as we're seeing in America, it's America first. Uh, I have no doubt that our politicians will have to be sensitive to that and articulate the justifications for foreign engagement in ways that are sensitive to those movements.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, if you think about India's defense industry push, the Make in India, that taps into a not incomparable sentiment, and so does our defense industry push. So my sense is that on defense issues particularly, we're not making too hard a case.
Mm-hmm. You know, one argument I've been hearing here, I don't know how far that's true, and perhaps you'll be able to explain it better. That one of the reasons, uh, well, one of the many reasons for Australia's sort of outreach to India is the sort of unpredictability of the U.S. with the Trump administration. So, do you think that's a valid kind of an argument, or do you think it's that's a totally separate relationship and it's got nothing to do with India?
I think that there is more concern in the Australian government, which obviously I do not speak on behalf of. I think there's more concern in the Australian government about developments in the US than they will publicly acknowledge. But I think there's a recognition that the alliance has lasted quite some decades and it's reached a very intimate level. And when they consider key defence priorities, including AUKUS and developing those capabilities, there is no other option. It's America or nothing for them. So they're, on the one hand, doubling down on the alliance and hoping that instability that we're seeing in the US is something that doesn't reflect a long-term trend. While that's happening, there are lots of reasons that Australia was becoming a lot more serious about engaging its region, including India. My sense is that the instability we see in the US is doubling down on that imperative. So they're not unrelated, but the answer is the same. Regardless what happens, the answer is engage more with the region, try to ensure that we collaborate as a region to ensure that our efforts add up to more than the sum of their parts. Where there is architecture that we can create to ensure that we're not overly reliant on any single partner, we should be doing that. And where we can create flexibility and resilience and agility, we should be creating that. You don't create those kinds of attributes simply by doubling down on a relationship with one or two countries. You do it by engaging as much of the region as you can and building a sense of trust and demystifying each other, understanding what our relative strengths are and understanding what our relative weaknesses are, which is why I'm quite excited to see where the relationship with India will go on the defence front, simply because India brings astonishing strengths that Australia cannot, and Australia has its own niches that it can contribute as well. And between them, we can mitigate shortcomings and we can maximise strengths.
Mm-hmm. Talking about the AUKUS, there's been a few hiccups in between about whether or not Trump is going to keep supporting the whole program or whether it's not going to go on or whatever. What are your personal views on the program as a whole? And I mean, do you think it is worth pursuing?
I have to make a confession. I was reasonably agnostic about AUKUS when it was first announced. I think now I'm less confident that platforms will be delivered on time. But if I sit from the position of an Australian decision maker, with the timelines involved and the alternatives that are available, really the only option that they have available to them now is to ensure that they get the greatest possible uh, capabilities and benefits from this deal. So I don't feel bold enough to make a prediction about what will happen and whether things will be delivered on time. I think that I would leave that to more qualified experts. Um, but I do think in some ways this points what this demonstrates is you think about Australian capabilities, you think about our intelligence, our platforms, our fast jets. Well, a great many of our capabilities really rely on the backbone of US architecture. And I think this is the first time that probably Australian policymakers have had to consider, we have a very close relationship with the US, but we can't guarantee that we will have the kinds of enablers that we've relied on in the past in every circumstance. And I think that shows that we really need to start thinking about our own resilience and bolstering some of the other capabilities that perhaps we haven't required in the same context when we've embedded in a broader US military coalition.
Another interesting thing that's been happening is that the small islands of Australia, sort of eastern coast, there's a lot of Chinese influence happening there, and there's a lot of talk that Australia is not taking the kind of proactive measures there as it should. Is that a right thing? I mean, to sort of believe, or is Australia doing
So
something about that?
I'm not a Pacific expert. It wouldn't shock me as someone who's been around Australian defence and foreign policy circles that we are not immune from responding reactively, so to speak. Our defence and foreign policy has been imperfect. We will at times be distracted, and of course, sometimes we'll fall into the trap of pursuing our own priorities, but not doing as good a job as we should at listening to what is required by the region. My great fear, and this applies not just to the Pacific, it applies to any number of regions. I think one of the biggest mistakes we can make is to imply that we are only engaging because we are concerned about China's influence. I think we should be engaging because these regions are important in their own right. And that includes Southeast Asia, whose economic and strategic importance is huge and has been huge for quite some time. And I think the Pacific has its own importance and its own priorities. So my sense is that we're probably, an analogy might be that we've been learning to drive a forklift or a tractor, and we've been moving quite in big muscle movements, and at times not being acting with the finesse that is required. I think we're seeing a slow recalibration. Um, and this is another avenue for cooperation between India and Australia because we experience some of those similar dynamics. India obviously has its desire to ensure that it retains influence in its near region. And it's a delicate balance when you're the larger power in the region, right? So it's a mix of using the resources that you have available, being sensitive to political and cultural contexts in the regions you're engaging, and building influence rather than making diktats. So I suspect we have made some missteps, particularly in the Pacific. I don't know that the threshold or the test for misstep or success should only be viewed in the prism of whether we competed with China.
You know, we seem to be running a bit out of time, but let me come back to the
Sure.
India-Australia relationship. Um, Australia definitely has been reaching out in a major way towards India, and I think India is reciprocating. But where do you see any challenges, if any, in this whole, let's say, security relationship and then the economic one? Economic one, I think we should be doing pretty okay. But do you see any potential hiccups in the security relationship?
One thing that I'm keen to see is a transition from a reliance on top-down investment and momentum to ground-up momentum. And what I mean by that is, um, you know, I think on both sides, bureaucratic structures and habits precluded them from taking full advantage of the benefits that they offered each other. And we're actually really lucky that Prime Minister Narendra Modi and successive Australian Prime Ministers really helped to kind of crack open the door and get the bureaucracies to widen their view and understand what the potential benefits might be. The problem is that you can get into a habit whereby you rely on that kind of intervention. But even if we don't have some kind of a hiccup, even if the relationship is quite fine, but leaders on either side end up inevitably managing priorities elsewhere, I mean, their focus can't always, I don't anticipate that the Prime Minister of India's focus can always be on Australia. So what are the systems doing about that? And what I'd like to see is a lot more organic working level cooperation. It shouldn't be enough that we just sign an agreement and it makes for a good announcement and we send the strategic signaling we want to send. I'd actually like to see the militaries on both sides take full advantage of those agreements, squeeze every last piece of benefit from them, understand their shortcomings, take them right up to the line and start taking the reins of this and driving their own momentum. I think we're seeing signs of that, but there's room to grow. I don't anticipate any explicit political crises, but of course things can come up in any relationships. And our job, I think, as defence professionals, or especially when I was working within the government, is to create the kind of architecture that is resilient to that. Political relationships will have their ebb and flow, and that's okay. The importance is that military professionals build trust, they understand each other, and they know how to respond when they're called on to cooperate on any kind of operation, whether it's humanitarian assistance or some higher intensity kind of a scenario.
I think we have time for just one last question.
Sure.
Slightly touchy question, but still is something that's on people's minds here. We were talking about your article about, Australia having to sort of take a call on its relationship with Pakistan because of its ties with India. Um, while you haven't advocated that, it's either one or the other, or, that kind of a thing, you're saying that, it has to be calibrated for both. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
So I guess one thing that probably applies to many countries, but is a particular line of effort that Australia has made. It's often seen defence links as a tie of last resort in any number of contexts. So, my job when I was working in defence was to make good relationships with defence systems that I didn't always share the same values with. And we may have actually had some real political disagreements or concerns about behaviour on any number of fronts, whether that's human rights or terrorism. And the underlying logic behind that in the Australian system is that it's better to have some ties on defence because when everything else fails, when the political relationship is fraught, but we need to pick up the phone, often it helps to pick up the phone with a military member. And at times we see that as a means of setting us up to at least exert what little influence we can. Are we better off engaging a country openly and then occasionally giving a quiet word behind the scenes to influence things, or are we better off to openly distance ourselves? These are all open debates, and I think that often they're very context dependent. Australia's approach with Pakistan, I think, has been quite cautious and more calibrated than is probably obvious from the outside. We have a lot of bilateral interests in Pakistan, and as you can imagine, if you want to pursue those, you really need some kind of a healthy relationship with the Pakistani military. And so that leaves the defence system in a bit of a careful position because it wants to build those trusted links, but it doesn't want to contribute necessarily to the kinds of capabilities that would be helpful for the international community. So what you'll see in the Australian relationship with Pakistan on the defence front is a pretty carefully calibrated relationship that focuses on educational exchanges, visits from service chiefs to service chief, that kind of collaboration, offering postgraduate study to a Pakistani officer who might come to a university in Australia. So as a defence practitioner, I can see how that's being calibrated. My critique of that is that I can understand where that desire comes from. But we're in a very constrained strategic environment, and we have a lot of a short amount of time to really make ourselves more resilient to it. And we should be very sensitive to India's experience of terrorism, which is very understandable. My own frustration when I deployed to Afghanistan was the fact that insurgents could conduct terrorism and jump across the border. So that's another thing that we should understand and respect. So my sense is that given the limited resources we have, wouldn't we be better off investing some of those resources in areas where they may go further? One example is we might ordinarily be giving a master's level billet to a Pakistani military officer, and that creates valuable ties that I mentioned. But gosh, couldn't that go so much further if we allocated those resources to other Indian Ocean countries? So like the Maldives as an example. Aren't there ways that we could sort of allocate it to reflect our priorities a little bit more effectively and consider the fact that Australia is quite a modestly sized country? Our efforts in Pakistan aren't going to miraculously influence its strategic culture overnight, but our efforts in a smaller country may have considerable benefits. And that would complement India's own efforts in the Indian Ocean as well. So I think there's some discussions, that to be had here. I think bureaucracies tend to be reluctant to make changes like that, not necessarily because they have a carefully, extreme high priorities to pursue, but because no bureaucracy likes to cede influence. Once you've eked out a position in a country, every bureaucrat's tendency is to think, "Wow, we might need that one day, so we should hold on to it." And I think that there may be an element of that in the Australian system. So I'd say when the Australia-Pakistan relationship comes up, sometimes it can appear as though we're selling weapons. As far as I know, we're not. It can look as though we're enabling provocative capabilities. We're not. There's less to this than meets the eye. But I think there are some serious questions about how Australia calibrates its approach and how it doubles down on the things that really matter strategically and what we must do versus what it would be nice to do.
This is such a fascinating conversation. It could have gone on for at least another hour, but I'm sorry we've run out of time. Thank you so very much. And I'm sure with people like you around, India-Australia ties can only get, much, much better. Thank you so very much, Kim. I appreciate you taking time out, and I look forward to having you with us again.
Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it and happy to talk anytime.
That was Kim Herriot-Darragh, Research Fellow at the Australia-India Institute, offering us his candid views on bilateral ties and where we are headed. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist, and I look forward to seeing you again. Till then, this is Ramananda Sengupta.